What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.
Good morning. The first item of business is general questions, and at question number 1 I call Jackie Baillie.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to protect primary care services in light of reports showing the workforce and demand pressures on general practice.
Cabinet Secretary Humza Yousaf.
I am immensely grateful to GPs and, of course, GP practice staff up and down the country who do an incredible job during a period of significant challenge. We're absolutely committed to ensuring that being a GP remains an attractive career choice with a manageable workload. Despite the pandemic, we've recruited 3,220 whole-time equivalent healthcare professionals to provide support to GPs, underpinned by an investment commitment of over £500 million since 2018. We have a record number of GPs working in Scotland, and we're committed to 800 additional GPs by the end of 2027.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response, but he should know that statistics for 2022 show that the whole-time equivalent number of GPs has actually fallen to 3,493. That's 81 fewer than in 2017 when the SNP announced its intention to boost GP numbers. So does the Cabinet Secretary agree with Dr Andrew Bewis of the BMA, who says that the SNP's government's failure to boost GP numbers and provide sufficient funding has locked primary care into a vicious circle of rising workloads, forcing GPs out of the profession?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm sure Jackie Baillie knows, but it was maybe just an oversight, that our target for between 2017 and 2027 was based on headcount numbers. And of course, overall GP headcount numbers have increased by 291, from 4,918 to 5,209. So there has been an increase in headcount GPs, and we're making good progress towards that 800 figure. In terms of full-time equivalents, the issue that Jackie Baillie raises, of course, we are engaging both with Dr Andrew Bewis, who I meet very regularly, and also the RCGP, and what more we can do in relation to retention. Although it should be recognised that more flexible working patterns is a good thing. It helps with that work-life balance, which in itself we hope can help with retention. I would commend the RCGP report that they released just before Christmas, focusing on a number of initiatives the government may want to explore in relation to retention of GPs, and will continue to engage both with the BMA and with the RCGP on these important issues.
Sandesh Gulhani.
Announcing total funding hides the fact that the Scottish Government made cuts this year to GP and primary care. Pressure on GPs is only going to increase, given we have 23 fewer GPs than last year, Greater Glasgow and Clyde announced yesterday they are pausing non-urgent elective surgery and going to an emergency footing despite the money. And this is going to increase care in primary care. And also long COVID. We heard today many people on BBC Scotland Radio who are suffering and who are saying the service is failing them. A nurse we cheered and clapped for during the pandemic says she will lose her job and her home because of long COVID. If patients are saying they can't get help from hospitals, they're going to go to GP and increase pressure. What more are you willing to do to help long COVID patients?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, what I would say to Dr Sandesh Gohani is, of course, he's right. We did have to make some really difficult choices around our budget this year, including the reprofiling of funding from primary care. We did that, of course, because his party completely mismanaged the economy of the United Kingdom, and high inflation costs meant that our budget and health and social care portfolio was worth £650 million less than when we set it the previous December. So these difficult decisions had to be made because we don't have those full fiscal levers in our own hands. So what we will do is continue to ensure that we invest in those multidisciplinary teams that will help to spread the workload right from GPs right across other members of staff. We'll also continue to invest in NHS 24, for example, where people get really excellent advice. And I announced, of course, additional recruitment of 200 staffing on long COVID. He knows we have a commitment of £10 million over 3 financial years, and will continue to invest in that funding to help long COVID sufferers, as well as anybody else suffering any condition at a time of great pressure on our NHS.
Beatrice Wishart.
A Shetland GP surgery posted on social media this week that, and I quote, "Due to high demand and staff availability, we are currently dealing with clinically urgent requests only. If your request is of a non-urgent nature, please consider contacting us next week." What can the Scottish Government say to those seeking medical help and the staff under pressure in our island NHS services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say that this has been, and continues to be, of course, but certainly has been in the last few weeks, one of the most difficult periods I think the NHS has ever faced in its existence. And we know that as a result of the accumulative impact, of course, of the pandemic, rising COVID cases. You'll know from the last ONS data that was sitting at 1 in 25 when the data was released on Friday. Flu cases higher than they have been in many years. Strep A cases rising, and other viral infections rising too. And all of that, and then during the festive period, of course, coming at a time of cold snap weather too. So all of these factors combining have made this a really difficult period for the NHS and social care right up and down the country. What are we doing? I stood up on Tuesday to give some detail of what we're doing to support, including, of course, helping with the issues around discharge, investing further in NHS 24 service available up and down the country. And difficult decisions will have to be made at a local level, whether it's in NHS Shetland or elsewhere. But I hope that these difficult decisions that are being made will be time limited, and while the additional support that we provided kicks in, and as those flu cases, COVID cases, I hope in time, of course, begin to abate, that helps the health service through what is a really difficult time. And my gratitude once again to every single member of the NHS and social care working so hard during these difficult times.
Question number 2, Gordon MacDonald.
Scottish Government when it last met with the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I have not yet met with the current Chancellor, and I did not have the opportunity to meet with either of his 2 predecessors. I last met the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on the 17th of November after the United Kingdom autumn statement.
Gordon MacDonald.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Forecasts compiled by Consensus Economics show the UK facing the worst and longest recession in the G7. The Office for Budget Responsibility predicts that we are facing the biggest fall in living standards since record began due to inflation, and more than 3/4 of members of the British Chambers of Commerce say the UK Tory Brexit deal is not helping them increase sales or grow their business. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what economic levers the Scottish Government needs in order to escape a future of Westminster failure, build on Scotland's economic strengths and become as successful as comparable independent European countries?
Cabinet Secretary.
It is becoming very clear with all of the available evidence of the economic damage that is being done by the Brexit that was imposed upon Scotland by the United Kingdom Conservative Government. And the specific areas where we are suffering is obviously in relation to free trade with the European Union, where companies are suffering just now, so an independent country with the ability to rejoin the EU would be an advantage. We know from the failures of the energy market that the ability to redesign the energy market would be an important attribute for Scotland to have. The ability to use employment laws to ensure fairer work would be an advantage, and crucially, the ability to have a migration policy designed to boost our working age population would be an advantage which can only come with Scottish independence, given the hostility to such approaches by the United Kingdom Government. So I think Mr MacDonald correctly highlights the severe economic damage being undertaken by Brexit and the opportunities that Scottish independence would give to create much more fiscal flexibility for the Government in Scotland.
Question number 3, Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on its response to the Climate Change Committee's reports, Progress in Reducing Emissions in Scotland 2022 report to Parliament and Scottish Emissions Targets First Five-Yearly Review.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Scottish Ministers will take the appropriate time to consider the recommendations from the Climate Change Committee's advice and respond in the spring. We will work closely with the Climate Change Committee as part of our continuous review of policy to ensure we benefit fully from their expertise, whilst progressing delivery and considering possible new actions. The Committee's advice will also support development of the next climate change plan, which will be published in full later this year.
Liam Kerr.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but the committee said that SNP targets weren't accompanied by deep thinking about policies and rather accused ministers of magical thinking. Now, clearly, this portfolio must be prioritised, but I've discovered the Scottish Government has only 6 people working on its Climate Justice Fund, whilst just 4 are dealing with the Loss and Damage Fund announced at COP27. Compare that with the 25 civil servants working on an independence prospectus costing £1.5 million a year. And this government's skewed priorities are very clear. So will the Cabinet Secretary be taking steps to realign government resources away from the manufacture of grievance and division and instead direct it towards delivering practical priorities to address the climate emergency?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we always deploy staff within the civil service to make sure we take forward our areas of policy priority, and that's why Scotland's emissions are down by well over 50% on the 1990 baseline, which takes us over halfway and, of course, has us ahead of other parts of the UK in addressing climate change. And what I can assure the member is that we will continue to take forward a range of policies to tackle the issue of climate change, to ensure we do so in a fair and just way. And I would gently point out to the member, we certainly won't tackle climate change effectively if we're opening up new coal mines.
Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Climate Change Committee report recognises key policy areas, for example, in industry and electricity supply sectors, are reserved to the UK Government. So to what extent is meeting our net zero targets here in Scotland reliant on decisions taken by the UK Government, and how is the Scottish Government working with the UK Government to ensure that our ambition in Scotland are matched by the rest of the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there's a range of areas that, of course, are the responsibility of the Scottish Government, and we take them seriously and pursue policies to make sure we deliver on our statutory climate change targets. But there are also areas which are reserved to the UK Government that have a direct impact on climate change policy here in Scotland. In the energy sector in particular, for example, negative emission technologies play an extremely important part in helping to make sure we meet our climate change targets here in Scotland and actually across the whole of the UK, which is why taking forward carbon capture and the Acorn project is mission critical not only to Scotland's climate change targets, but also to the UK's climate change targets. And any further delay in making a decision about supporting something like CCUS and the Acorn project just creates uncertainty, risk around employment, a lack of investment in key areas, and places a greater burden in other policy areas, which is why we need the UK Government to step up to the plate and show leadership in this area and give the go-ahead to the Acorn project here in Scotland.
Mercedes Vialba.
very grateful to the presiding officer for taking the question. If we are to meet our national target of reducing car mileage by 20% by 2030, reliable, affordable and readily available public transport will be key. One of the Climate Change Committee's recommendations to achieving this is to invest in sustainable forms of transport, yet the Scottish Government is proposing widespread service cuts to Scotland's railway. So will the Minister think again and rule out service reductions to demonstrate his government's commitment to Scotland's railway, to protect jobs and to reduce transport emissions?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do recognise that access to good public transport is an important part of helping to get people out of their cars into public transport, which is why we've been making significant investment in our railways in order to decarbonise them. We're now at the point where I think over 75% of all journeys on Scotland's railways are actually in electrified routes, which has been decarbonised as a result of the investment this government has made, and why we've made significant investment in helping to decarbonise the bus system by actually investing in, through grant schemes, to support the electrification of the bus network through electric buses, which are now being rolled out. And I'm sure the member would also recognise we're now at the point where almost 50% of people in Scotland actually travel on our bus network for free as a result of the concessions travel scheme that we have for those that are over 60 and for those that are under 22. I'm sure the member would welcome that as an example of showing leadership and encouraging people onto our public transport network.
Thank you. We're moving on to question 4. I'd appreciate concise questions and responses, and I call Michelle Thomson.
To ask the Scottish Government what steps are being taken to reduce bladder cancer deaths.
Minister Marie Todd.
Bladder cancer mortality reduced by 14% over the period 2010 to 2020, and we are committed to continuing to improve this. As outlined in our Endoscopy and Urology Diagnostic Recovery and Renewal Plan, we will refresh and implement Once for Scotland's clinical pathways to prioritise demand for cystoscopy, including bladder cancers. We have also introduced 6 urology hubs in Scotland. These hubs provide rapid access to diagnostic procedures to enable earlier cancer diagnosis and treatment.
Michelle Thomson.
I thank the Minister for her response. Bladder cancer is one of the highest mortality rates of all cancers, currently around 50%. It also has a high rate of reoccurrence, making it one of the most expensive cancers to treat fully. With Scotland's ageing population, it will likely result in longer-term, more complex treatments. To that end, could the Minister confirm what funding has been made available specifically for research into bladder cancer, including treatment of the disease and data gathered to enable correlative research?
Minister.
The funding schemes supported by the Scottish Government's Chief Scientist Office, the CSO, provide opportunities for applied health research across a whole range of health challenges, including bladder cancer. Applications are assessed through independent expert review, with funding decisions based on the recommendations of independent expert committees. They'd be very happy to consider any applications for research into bladder cancer. CSO also contributes financially to a range of National Institute for Health and Care research funding schemes, which are open to applications from researchers in Scotland. And in addition, CSO invests through NHS Research Scotland in a cancer research network to support the delivery of studies in this area. Finally,
Minister.
Finally, our National Cancer Quality Programmes developed a Quality Performance Indicators, QPIs, for bladder cancer, first published in November 21, and it's encouraging that targets relating to 30 and 90-day mortality rates indicate a good performance.
Thank you. Question number 5, Willie Rennie.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what it is doing to support young people's mental health services, including in colleges and universities.
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government continues to provide record funding in mental health services to ensure that all children and young people have access to the right mental health support at the right time. This includes continued investment in improving CAMS services, funding 230 new and enhanced community supports and services for children, young people and their families, and providing access to counselling services for all secondary school pupils. In addition, we have exceeded our commitment to deliver 80 additional counsellors in further and higher education, with 89 additional counsellors now working to support students across institutions.
Willie Rennie.
If that's the case, I'm flummoxed as to why the government is even considering cutting those very mental health counsellors that he just described in colleges and universities at the end of this academic year. Now, I can remind them that 2/3 of college students report having low well-being and more than half report moderate to severe symptoms of depression. If that's the case, why is it, when students need their help, that the government's withdrawing the support of the very people that were designed to give them the help?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, as I said in my previous answer, we've exceeded the 80 counsellors that we planned for, with 89. And the Student Mental Health Plan, which is being taken forward by the Student Mental Health and Wellbeing Working Group and will sit alongside the Scottish Government's forthcoming Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy, will inform the Scottish Government's future approach to student mental health and wellbeing. Upon publication in spring of 2023, it will provide the framework for institutional action on this issue. And as part of this, officials will work with the universities and colleges sectors to move to a position where they fund elements of student mental health support, including counsellors, as part of their core offer to students.
Thank you. Question 6 was withdrawn. Question 7 not lodged. I call Richard Leonard at question 8.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it expects the replacement booking system for CalMac to be fully operational.
Minister Jenny Gilruth.
CalMac's new booking system, Arturus, is expected to go live across all CalMac routes in the spring of 2023. I am extremely disappointed that there has been a delay in the introduction of Arturus, which I do not think is acceptable. My officials in Transport Scotland have engaged with CalMac and have been informed that it will be operational by this spring. I will be meeting CalMac next week to seek further assurances to that end. The benefits of Arturus include better live deck space management for the use of capacity, better communication around disruption, a standardised, accessible, digitally enabled service both online and apps as a means to purchase tickets and also to apply any changes instantly.
Richard Leonard.
Can I thank the Minister for that reply? But the problem that the Minister has got is this. The project started as far back as August 2016. More than 5 years on, in December 2021, we were told by the Government it would be completed and operational by February 2022. In July 2022, we were told it would be completed and operational by November 2022. Then just last month, on the 8th of December, we were told that it would go live in the spring, but 11 days later, on the 19th of December, we were told it would not be operational now until November 2023. Don't Scotland's islanders, dependent on lifeline services, working in fragile economies, deserve an explanation, deserve urgent action, and don't they deserve a lot more honesty from this government?
Minister.
I will provide Mr Leonard with an honest response, and I hope he heard in my initial response my own disappointment and my own commitment to seek further assurances from CalMac in relation to the repeated delays on the introduction of the system. But it is absolutely important and vital, I think, for islanders that we get the implementation of the new system right for Scotland's island communities. Now, CalMac have advised my officials in Transport Scotland that their user acceptance testing has highlighted a number of issues that have been anticipated given the complexity of the number of routes that CalMac serves. It's really important those issues are addressed before the system is launched, and its supplier has been working to address those issues. The member will also understand that I require to have confidence as Minister that this new system is going to work for islanders and for visitors to our islands alike. To that end, I will continue to work with CalMac on achieving that cast iron assurance to ensure this new system will deliver the improvements that passengers and islanders need to see.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. The next item of business is First Minister's questions, and at question number 1 I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Last night, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde cancelled thousands of procedures. We know the SNP's flagship Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is already the worst performing in the country. And this morning, there are reports of nurses at the hospital working 24-hour shifts. It's disgraceful to put NHS staff in that situation. And despite their incredible efforts, it could be harmful to patients. A whistleblower has said this, their words, "We are struggling to cope." In short, we're struggling to provide first world care in what feels like a third world environment. Given this, how can the First Minister say the Health Secretary has done all he can to support NHS staff and prepare for this crisis?
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, in relation to reports in the media this morning about staff in Greater Glasgow and Clyde being asked to work 24-hour shifts, that, as I am assured by NHS Greater and Glasgow and Clyde, and as the Board has said publicly, is not true. Let me just quote NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. There is absolutely no truth to these claims. The NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde does not ask nursing staff to work a 24-hour shift, and there was no prospect that any staff member would need to work for 24 hours. To suggest otherwise is inaccurate and misleading. And I would not expect any health board to request any member of staff to do that. Secondly, Presiding Officer, staff across the National Health Service in Scotland, indeed staff across the National Health Services in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are struggling right now. They're doing an extraordinary and a magnificent job, and my heartfelt thanks go to all of them. But they are struggling in the face of unprecedented pressure on our National Health Service, pressure from COVID, even more so in recent weeks from flu and, of course, from other respiratory illnesses. We hope that pressure will abate in the weeks to come, but in the meantime, the Government continues to do everything possible to support NHS boards as they address those pressures. Now, lastly, Presiding Officer, in relation to the announcement from Greater Glasgow and Clyde last night, as I said on Monday, we have empowered NHS boards to take action that they think is appropriate to protect critical and life-saving care. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has paused non-urgent elective procedures in order that they can prioritise urgent treatment and cancer care, and I would expect that to be for a very short period. And finally, this is my final point, Presiding Officer, I think it insults people's intelligence to suggest that the problems being encountered in the NHS in Scotland, which are the same as the problems being encountered elsewhere, are somehow down to the Health Secretary. Is it, for example, the fault of Hamza Yousaf that the kind of action that Greater Glasgow and Clyde announced last night has also been taken in health services in South London, in Surrey, in York, Scarborough, in Derby, in Leicester, in Nottingham, in Southampton and in Portsmouth, and I probably could go on. These are unprecedented pressures which we continue to support our NHS to address.
Douglas Ross.
How can nationalist MSPs actually clap such a despicable answer from Scotland's First Minister in Scotland's Parliament about Scotland's National Health Service? So let's ignore the nationalist MSPs. Let's look at what medical professionals are saying. They are damning about this government's response to this crisis here in Scotland. On Monday, the First Minister placed some of the blame for the grave situation in A&E departments on, in her own words, unnecessary attendances. But Dr Leila Peel, Deputy Chair of BMA Scotland, criticised patient-blaming language, saying, and these are her words, it shows a lack of understanding of the current crisis. We've analysed the figures, and Dr Peel is spot on. There are actually fewer people in A&E now than there were in the years leading up to the COVID pandemic. The problem is not unnecessary attendances. Fewer people attended A&E in the first week of this year than they did in 2020, 2019, 2018 or 2017. So will the First Minister accept that the blame lies with her government and not the patients?
First Minister. Nobody, including me, certainly not me, is blaming patients. It is the case. Well,
let's hear the First Minister. Thank you.
Unnecessary visits to accident and emergency, unnecessary attendances and admissions to hospital are not in the interests of patients. That's why we are working hard to make sure that where patients can be and should be treated elsewhere, that happens. Now, let me just take the points made by Douglas Ross in turn, and let's look in detail at demand and why the figures that he has quoted are actually the case. There is absolutely no doubt that demand on our health service right now is higher than it has been for some time. If we look at calls to NHS 24 over the festive period, the highest demand in a decade. If we look at emergency calls to the Scottish Ambulance Service, higher in the most recent week than the average of the 4 weeks before that. The reason that they are not all translating into attendances at accident, emergency or admissions to hospital is because of the work NHS 24 and the Scottish Ambulance Service are doing to avoid that. So the NHS 24 now provides advice and, where necessary, treatment to the vast majority of patients during the initial call that they make. In terms of the ambulance service, most of the calls to the ambulance service are treated through see and treat, so the patients are not taken to hospital. But those, because of that, those who do go to hospital tend to be sicker and their length of stay is longer. That is part of the reason we have pressure on our hospitals. And the waiting times in E&E, of course, are a reflection of the fact that occupancy in our hospitals are so high, which is why we are focused on speeding up discharge from hospital where appropriate. And finally, Presiding Officer, we listen very carefully to, engage with, work with health professionals each and every single day, and it would be hard for me to find the words appropriate to describe my respect for our health professionals. But of course, elsewhere in the UK this week, we've seen healthcare professionals on strike. They've not been on strike in Scotland because of the work this Health Secretary has done and because of the respect that we have for our healthcare professionals.
Douglas Ross.
I think those words may come back to haunt the First Minister, but, you know, if we're judging Cabinet Secretaries on sectors striking, I would hate to be Shirley Ann Somerville right now, I've got to say that. And we've just heard it. The First Minister is doubling down on her patient-blaming language. The problem is not too many people attending A&E. The problem is this government's handling of the NHS crisis here in Scotland. Dr Peel said exit block is the problem in A&E. And the government have known this has been a huge issue for years. The First Minister was defending her position in the last answer by saying people are getting sicker, but people healthy and ready to go home can't get out of hospital because the First Minister and her government haven't dealt with bed blocking. They were failing to tackle this before the COVID pandemic, and now it's worse than ever. New reports today state that the number of avoidable deaths is now 60 people a week in Scotland. Shocking. That's 60 families across our country grieving every single week the loss of a loved one who could have been saved. So, First Minister, will you confirm those tragic figures?
First Minister.
What I will absolutely confirm is that when people wait too long for treatment, that has severe consequences potentially for patients. That is why we work so hard and will continue to work so hard with the health service to reduce long waits for treatment, whether that's an accident emergency or whether it is for elective care on our National Health Service. Now, I wasn't, to use Douglas Ross's phrase, doubling down on anything, and I certainly, for the avoidance of any doubt, I am not blaming patients for anything. It is in the interests of patients to make sure that, where appropriate, they can be treated outside of hospital, because it's not in the interest of any patient to end up in an accident emergency unit or in a hospital ward just because treatment is not available in the community. What I was doing was trying to, because it's obvious from his questions that Douglas Ross doesn't understand this, explain the flow of patients through our National Health Service and why we see longer waits in accident emergency. It's because of over-occupancy in our hospital wards. And finally, on the exit block, the significant chunk of what I and the Health Secretary set out on Monday was about tackling delayed discharges. Now, we understand from our daily engagement with
Let's
health
hear
boards
the First Minister,
that we
please.
have seen delayed discharges reduce slightly in recent weeks, but there is much more to do. So that was the reason for the interventions and the additional funding that I indicated on Monday and the Health Secretary set out to the Chamber on Tuesday. So we will continue to be focused on providing the support and making the interventions that are necessary right now to help the NHS during this period of unprecedented demand. And let me remind Douglas Ross and the Chamber, unprecedented demand that is being faced not just in Scotland but all over the UK and indeed in much of the rest of the world as well.
Douglas Ross.
The First Minister can throw insults at me if she wants. I was quoting well, she laughs at this. You can laugh at that, First Minister, if you want, but I was quoting a frontline doctor in Scotland's NHS who happens to be the Deputy Chair of the BMA in Scotland. But the First Minister effectively confirmed those tragic figures we heard this morning are correct. 60 avoidable deaths every single week in Scotland's NHS, confirmed by Scotland's First Minister. And Scotland's Health Secretary is making the situation worse, not better. Here's just one example of what we're experiencing across Scotland. On Hogmanay, a family visited their 80-year-old uncle. He's had major heart surgery, hip operations, and often struggles to breathe. When they arrived, they discovered he'd fallen and broken his neck. The family dialled 999 7 times, and it took more than 12.5 hours for the ambulance to arrive. 7 emergency calls, 12.5 hours for an 80-year-old who had broken their neck. His niece told us the ambulance crews were brilliant, but we are disgusted at what our uncle has been put through. This dire situation confirms yet again this Health Secretary and this government is not on top of this crisis. His failures are creating risk to lives across the country. First Minister, surely for the good of Scotland, it's time to sack Humza Yousaf.
First Minister. If I've raised a smile in response to Douglas Ross, it was not directed at any health professional. I suppose what I was raising a smile about in very challenging circumstances where everybody right now is Douglas Ross accusing anybody else of insults. I think that is... Every single day with the Health Secretary will continue to take the actions that are necessary to support our NHS during these very difficult times. I said earlier on, and I don't take anything for granted, and I am not intending to sound complacent at all about this, but it's because we respect so highly those who work in the front line of our National Health Service that we are offering them right now a much higher pay increase for next year than any other government anywhere else in the UK, and thus far we have avoided industrial action in our National Health Service, and we will continue to do everything we can to make sure that continues. We're also supporting health boards to address the reasons for long waits in our National Health Service, whether that is waits for an ambulance or waits in accident emergency or long waits to be discharged from hospital. That's why we announced the action that we did earlier this week. There are too many patients right now waiting too long for treatment, and we will continue to do everything we can to address that, while we hope these pressures caused by COVID and by flu in the main abate over the weeks to come. But that should not take away from the fact, and this is true in the ambulance service, it is true in our accident and emergency units, it's true in our GP practices, it's true across our hospitals and other healthcare settings. The vast majority of patients in this country, even during these extremely difficult times, get excellent care on our National Health Service, and that is down to the dedication of those who work in it, and that's why they have my grateful thanks each and every single day.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, yesterday Jackie Baillie and I hosted a health summit with frontline NHS staff, representative organisations and experts working across our NHS. They told us that our NHS is broken and the system is failing, that they are being asked to do the impossible, and that every day this crisis puts patients' lives at risk. And they were united in telling us that the cause of this crisis is not COVID, is not the flu, is not strep A, and is not winter pressures. They say that this is a crisis that is 10 years in the making. But the First Minister does not agree. So why does she think frontline NHS staff are wrong?
First Minister.
I don't think frontline health service staff are wrong in what they say, but I do think, I don't know why it took until yesterday for Anna Sarwar and Jackie Baillie to meet with health service professionals. The Health Secretary meets with them regularly, and I have engagements as well.
You probably never met them.
But what health service professionals say to us, what I'm sure they said to Anna Sarwar yesterday, is yes, there were pre-existing challenges in our National Health Service that go before COVID. We were taking action to address those. So if you look at funding in our National Health Service, frontline health funding has more than doubled under this government. It's higher per head of population than it is in other parts of the UK. There are almost 30,000 more people working in our National Health Service today than when this government took office. More healthcare professionals, whether that's doctors, qualified nurses or across a range of different professional groups than there are per head of population in other parts of the UK. So we will continue to work with frontline healthcare professionals to deal with these challenges. But what I do take issue with Anna Sarwar on is that somehow it is not the case that COVID and flu is having a very significant impact on these pressures. There are right now over 1,200 patients with COVID in our hospitals. Anybody who says that is not having an impact on what we're dealing with right now, frankly, is not dealing in reality. In the couple of weeks, I think, leading up to Christmas or over the Christmas period, there were 1,000 patients a week with flu admitted to our hospitals. Anybody who says that is not a significant factor in what we're dealing with right now is frankly not dealing in reality. And that's a comment directed at Anna Sarwar, not at healthcare professionals who are dealing with these issues each and every day. So whether it's on NHS pay, whether it's on record investment, record staffing numbers, we'll continue to support the NHS during these difficult times, as we always have done.
Anna Sarwar.
I think it's pretty clear from that answer who's not dealing with reality, and it's Nicola Sturgeon and her SNP government. She might not want to listen to me, but she should listen to the organisations, the Royal College of Nursing, the Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow, the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, the Royal College of General Practitioners, Glasgow Local Medical Committee, the British Medical Association in Scotland, Unison, GMB, Unite, all saying they've heard the excuses before, they don't believe it, and they think the First Minister is not doing enough. Because the sticky plaster approach will not solve the problem. We heard directly from staff about the impact that this crisis is having on them. They told us, in their words, that this is causing them moral injury. That is personal distress and trauma because they can't provide the care they know their patients need. Psychological and mental trauma for our NHS staff. One of them said that the conditions they were working in meant no dignity, no respect, no safety for patients. And the BME and the Royal College of Emergency Medicine have both said in stark terms that this crisis is leading to avoidable deaths. And they predict that could be as many as 60 avoidable deaths a week. The experts tell us that what was announced this week will not be enough to address the problem. So why can't the First Minister see that her sticky plaster approach is not working?
First Minister.
We'll continue to take a range of actions. What we announced this week was in addition to the actions already being taken, and of course the record investment that we are putting into our National Health Service in the next financial year, supported by the tax decisions we are taking, asking those who can most afford it to pay a bit more in tax. We'll see an additional £1 billion going into our National Health Service. So we will support investment, and where it is appropriate and in the interest of patients, we will support reform in care and patient pathways within our National Health Service. Nothing Anna Sarwar has said to me today hasn't already been said directly to government by healthcare professionals, because we engage day in and day out with them. They are dealing with unprecedented pressures right now. Some of that does necessitate longer-term reform in our National Health Service, but some of that is absolutely being caused by the winter pressures that have been at their peak in recent weeks. I would hope that over the coming weeks and very soon we will start to see flu levels reduce significantly, for example, and that will start to reduce some of that pressure on our hospitals. I think the situation with COVID remains more unpredictable and volatile given new variants that are circulating. So I hope we will see some of this pressure abate, but that will still leave a challenging situation in our health service, which is why the investment, the increase in staffing and the reforms continue to be so important. No government anywhere has a single solution to this right now, but this government remains focused on taking the actions that are necessary, which is why I think we do continue to have the trust of the people of Scotland as we do so.
Anna Sarwar.
The First Minister is just not listening. The First Minister is just not listening. And the approach is not working. This is not just a crisis in winter. This is a crisis that's all year round. And Nicola Sturgeon's excuses won't wash. The crisis in our NHS is not because of COVID, it's not because of flu, it's not because of strep A, it's not winter pressures. This is a crisis 15 years in the making. And the result, the longest ever NHS waiting list, 750,000 Scots waiting. The worst ever A&E waiting times, 2,000 people a week waiting more than 12 hours. Record levels of delayed discharge, 58,501 NHS bed days lost a month as a result. After 15 years of the SNP, our NHS is broken and the system is failing. Staff are being asked to do the impossible and patients are being asked to accept the unacceptable. Lives are being lost. Isn't it the case that the people that caused the problem can't be the ones to fix the problem?
First Minister.
On the latter point, that is, of course, always up to the people of Scotland, who they trust to be in government to lead the country through challenges. Of course, there were challenges in our health service before COVID. I have never sought to suggest otherwise. And the actions we were taking around investment, staffing, reforms to patient pathways are designed to address that. There are record numbers of staff in our health service right now, almost 30,000 more than when this government took office, and of course more staff per head of population than anywhere else in the UK. That is the reality. But I think people watching at home, listening to Anna Sarwar, around 1 in 25 of the Scottish population that have COVID right now, the many people watching at home who will be suffering from flu and other respiratory illnesses right now, to hear Anna Sarwar say that the fact that we've got 1,200 COVID patients in our hospitals right now, or that 1,000 patients with flu have been admitted a week in recent times to our hospitals, to hear Anna Sarwar say that has got nothing to do with the pressures in our NHS, we'll wonder what on earth Anna Sarwar is talking about. So we will continue to work with, listen to those on the front line of our National Health Service as we continue to strive to give them fair pay increases and as we continue to support them to deliver excellent care, as even during these tough times they continue to do for the vast majority of patients across our country.
Question number 3, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when the Cabinet will next meet.
First Minister.
Tuesday.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm very grateful for that reply. My opposition colleagues are quite right to raise the crisis in our NHS, and Liberal Democrat research has quantified just how bad things are. Last year, we discovered that 1 in 6 people who couldn't get a GP appointment actually carried out a medical procedure on themselves or got somebody else to do it. Presiding Officer, Maria is 22 years old. She is a Ukrainian refugee who has been living in Scotland since the summer. She suffers from a hormonal thyroid condition which requires regular testing and treatment. But when she presented to her new GP, she was faced with an unexpected dilemma. The wait was so long that it actually made more sense for her to risk travelling back to a war zone to see her doctor in Kiev. And so she did. Presiding Officer, the air raid sirens, the drone strikes and cruise missile attacks of the Ukrainian capital were less daunting to Maria than the wait for treatment in Scotland's NHS. That is appalling. These are the risks that people are taking for the sake of their own health, and all for the want of basic access to primary care. So can I ask the First Minister, is she embarrassed by this?
First Minister.
I don't know the circumstances beyond what Alex Cole-Hamilton has narrated of that case, and it would be wrong for me to comment on an individual case. What I do know is that we, again, continue to support general practice. There are more GPs per head of population in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK, 83 GPs per 100,000 population here, compared to 63 in England, 63 in Wales, 75 in Northern Ireland. We, of course, have a target that we are right now working towards delivery of increased numbers of GPs. We've recruited, I think, more than 3,000 members of the wider multidisciplinary teams in general practice and primary care. Access to GPs, like access to other parts of the health service right now, are challenging and very challenging for some patients, and we continue to work to address that, and we will continue to do that with record investment, record support for recruitment, and in partnership with those working so hard across our health service.
Question number 4, Fiona Hislop.
To ask the First Minister what the implications for Scotland and the Scottish Government are following Met Office reports that temperatures in Scotland and the UK reached the highest on record in 2022.
First Minister.
The Met Office figures underline that we are already experiencing climate change impacts in Scotland. We must adapt to these changes and prepare for further impacts of global climate change, which of course are already locked in. We are currently preparing the third climate change adaptation programme for publication next year to succeed the current programme. These programmes respond to the UK climate change risk assessments, which present the best available evidence and climate projections from organisations across the UK, including of course the Met Office. The Climate Change Committee has urged that risks from higher temperatures be prioritised in the upcoming programme, and we're working across government and with public bodies to ensure improved preparedness for a projected increase in hotter years in future.
Fiona Hislop.
These figures are indeed alarming, and across the world...
We will have a brief suspension. Okay, thank you, members. We will resume, and I call Fiona Hislop.
So these record temperature figures are indeed alarming. And across the world, we're seeing more extreme weather experiences with increased flooding and extreme heat at home. And every government bears acute responsibilities to tackle this climate emergency. With the draft Scottish Government Energy Strategy published this week and the Climate Change Committee's critical report published in December, does the First Minister acknowledge that this Government now needs to accelerate actual delivery on housing and transport emission reductions and a just transition to renewable energy? And will she ensure the Government's budget is sufficient and that public bodies ramp up on delivery, as on current trends we won't be meeting our ambitious net zero targets?
First Minister.
I absolutely agree with Fiona Hislop on all of that. It is worth pointing out, of course, that the energy strategy published this week with the Just Transition vision alongside that was in part about how we accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels in a fair and just manner to renewable and low carbon sources of energy. And I think that is really important. We must remain focused 100% on delivering our policy programme across the whole of society. That includes transport and the heating of homes. We have to decarbonise the energy system, as I've just said, and the draft energy strategy goes into detail about how we do that. We must make sure the climate change plan reflects all of that. A draft of that will be published later this year alongside sectoral just transition plans setting out a clear path for emissions reductions. And of course, we need to make sure the investment is in place to back all of that up. So this is something that the government remains focused on. We often talk about it in terms of a challenge, and much of it is challenging. But in all of this, there is also massive, massive opportunities for Scotland that we must seize.
Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. By 2050, there could be well over 100 heat-related deaths a year, according to the UK Climate Change Committee. Adapting buildings for cooling will be key to avoiding a worst-case scenario, and I welcome the joint work with the UK Government on this. So can the First Minister confirm when an assessment will be ready of the cooling systems required for current housing stock?
First Minister. On the question of when an assessment will be ready, I'll come back to the member with a precise answer on that. But I absolutely agree with them that this is an important strand of work. How we decarbonise heat in our buildings and the cooling of buildings is incredibly important as a part of the overall delivery of our climate change objectives. So we will continue to work where necessary in partnership with the UK Government, because some of the levers and powers lie with the UK Government. I'll be seeing the Prime Minister later this evening, and I'm sure these issues will be one of many issues that we touch upon. So these are all important. I'm sure we'll debate all of these issues, the detail of them, robustly in this chamber, but I also hope there will be a lot that unites us as we live up to the responsibility on our shoulders to help combat the climate emergency.
Question number 5, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister for what reason 2 ferries which will serve Islay are being built in Turkey.
First Minister.
In line with relevant procurement legislation, the ferries currently being built for service on the Islay routes were awarded following a full and open tendering process led by CMA, which of course is the procuring authority. The bid received from this yard represented the best value for money in terms of quality and price.
Liam Kerr.
Thank the First Minister for that answer, but the Climate Change Committee's report last month wasn't just critical, it was devastating in exposing this government's failures on the environment and emissions. So, is the First Minister comfortable that the steel for these 2 ferries is coming not from a Scottish steel mill, there's one around 40 miles from here, for example, but rather from China, the world's largest polluter, whose steel sector is the 2nd largest contributor to its emissions?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, on the procurement decisions, it's over recent weeks, the leader of the member's party has questioned me in this chamber, rightly so, and seemed to suggest that somehow we hadn't followed proper procurement policies in the award of other ferry contracts. So it's really important to stress that in all of these matters we comply with relevant procurement legislation. In terms of the steel, of course, that is a matter for the company that has the contract. The contract awarded is a standard international shipbuilding contract, and as such, the decision regarding materials and equipment lies with the shipyard. However, I understand that the shipyard may originally have intended to source steel from Ukraine, but obviously have had to look elsewhere. So these are decisions that the shipyard will take, and I'm sure they will apply all necessary objectives to the decisions that they reach.
Jenny Minto.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These 2 new ferries will each be able to carry up to 450 passengers and 100 cars or 14 commercial vehicles, giving a combined 40% increase in vehicle and freight capacity on the Islay route. This represents an improvement for islanders and businesses and underlines the Scottish Government's commitment to our island communities and the ferry network. Does the First Minister share my view that questions like the one we have just heard reiterate the fact that the Tories are interested in politicking and not people when it comes to the ferry network?
First Minister.
Well, I think Jenny Minto on that last point is absolutely right. But more importantly, I think people the length and breadth of Scotland, including in our island communities, will draw their own conclusions from the approach the Conservatives take to these issues. Jenny Minto, who of course represents in this Parliament a number of islands, is absolutely right. The award of these contracts is good news for islanders and island communities, and that's why it's important that they are progressing well. I understand there will be an update on steel cutting and keel new laying expected in the coming days. So we will continue to take decisions that are in the interest of those living in our island communities, such as the decision we're talking about right now.
Question number 6, Neil Bibby.
To ask the First Minister, in light of the extension of bus fare caps in England, whether the Scottish Government supports capping bus fares in Scotland for those aged between 22 and 60.
First Minister.
Well, I think the first thing to point out is that Scotland already has the most generous concessionary fare scheme in the UK. More than 2.3 million people in Scotland are eligible not for capped bus fares but for free bus travel in Scotland. We, of course, continue to develop and assess options to create a fairer and more transparent system of fares to maintain and increase affordability for those who do need it, and that is exactly why we're progressing the Fair Fares review. That review is considering cost and availability of services and the range of discounts and concessionary schemes available on all modes, including bus, rail and ferry.
Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The maximum cost of a single bus fare in London is £1.65. In this city, in Edinburgh, it's £1.85. In Manchester, Liverpool and West Yorkshire, where Labour mayors have taken control over transport, it's £2. It's £2 in Cardiff, and now it's £2 in every part of England for the next few months. Yet in Greater Glasgow, it can be as much as £2.65 for just a 2-mile journey. We really don't need a fares fare review to tell us that's not fair. It's time to cap fares and greater public control of buses, and for a bit of urgency. In a cost of living crisis, why are people in Scotland paying amongst the highest bus fares in the UK?
First Minister.
Well, of course, what Neil Bibby omits to say in that question is people over 60 don't pay anything at all for bus travel, which I think is replicated in other parts of the UK. But in Scotland, nobody under age 22 pays for bus travel either. It is not capped, it is free. 2.3 million people across our country eligible for completely free bus travel. Now, in terms of the question of capping costs for those who do pay, it is right that we progress any proposal like that through the Fair Fares review, so that we properly consider cost and availability of services and the whole range of discounts and concessionary schemes that are already available. So that's exactly what we will continue to do. But let me say yet again, because I think it's a fantastic statistic and reality, Presiding Officer, 2.3 million people in Scotland don't pay anything at all, don't pay a single penny to travel by bus in Scotland.
Thank you. We'll move to general and constituency supplementaries, and I call Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm referencing the exchanges on the pressures on the NHS. And while I understand that there are some 2 million people have access to the flu vaccine, 90% or so when they were getting their winter COVID booster, is there more that can be done for those eligible to access this? This flu is very, very serious indeed.
First Minister.
Yes, uptake levels for both COVID and flu vaccines are high, and that's to be welcomed. But we will continue to promote vaccine uptake for those who are eligible but haven't already been vaccinated. And we will, of course, think most carefully about those in the most vulnerable groups. But if we look at older care home residents in Scotland, these are figures, I think, for the first week in January, almost 90% vaccinated, which is higher than both England and Wales. For those over 50, 77% are vaccinated, again higher than other parts of the UK. But we will continue to work hard to encourage everybody who's eligible for a vaccine to take up that eligibility.
Ros McCall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is more than aware of the crisis facing the NHS. Last week, a whistleblower got in contact from the Accident Emergency Department within the Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy, expressing their concerns that patients were waiting for over 9 hours to be seen and that patient examinations were being conducted in the ambulances in the hospital grounds. Staff within the department believed a major incident criteria was met, but were not allowed to call or declare it as such. So can the First Minister confirm that no political direction was given to NHS Fife or any other health board for that matter to ensure that a major incident was not called? And will she agree to investigate why staff were not allowed to follow standard protocol?
First Minister.
I said on Monday, and in fact the Health Secretary has confirmed this to health boards in writing this week, that it is up to health boards, seeking advice and guidance from government where they think that is appropriate, but it is up to health boards to take whatever decisions they think might be appropriate to prioritise critical and life-saving care. In fact, Douglas Ross actually started his questioning to me today by criticising the fact that Greater Glasgow and Clyde have effectively done that by pausing non-urgent care in Glasgow. So the action...
Excuse me, First Minister. Members must treat one another with courtesy and respect, and I would appreciate it if there could be no interruptions at the moment. Continue, First Minister.
So, in a sense, the point I'm making, Presiding Officer, the action Greater Glasgow and Clyde announced last night demonstrates that health boards have the flexibility where they think that is necessary to take that action, and that is right and proper.
Jackie Baillie.
The fatal accident inquiry into the tragic fire at Cameron House Hotel more than 5 years ago reported yesterday, and I want to thank the Sheriff and the Lord Advocate for their assistance in getting to this point. The report included a range of recommendations designed to prevent this from happening again. Will the First Minister give a commitment today that all recommendations will be implemented as a matter of the utmost urgency, and will she also consider whether the Fire Brigade require further enforcement powers, as both Cameron House and the more recent fire at the New County Hotel in Perth appear to have been warned of fire risks but did nothing about them?
First Minister.
Firstly, in relation to the FAI report that was published yesterday, I'm also very grateful to the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service for their work on this extremely important fatal accident inquiry and for publication of the report. Let me also mark my thanks again to the emergency services for their response on the night of the fire, and of course my condolences again to those bereaved in this incident. Of course, we will thoroughly consider all of the Sheriff's recommendations. I would expect that, yes, we will accept all of the recommendations, but we have to go through a process of considering them properly, and we're required to respond to these in due course, and we will do that. In terms of enforcement, I think in light of Cameron House and indeed the more recent incident in Perth, and my condolences go to the bereaved in that incident as well, I think it would be right that there is a look at enforcement provisions. Under the Fire Scotland Act 2005, the Fire Service are appointed as the enforcing authority for fire in Scotland, and as part of that they produce all relevant enforcement procedures while applying the principles contained within the Scottish Regulator's Strategic Code of Practice. As the enforcing authority, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service work with duty holders in relevant premises to achieve compliance in fire safety through providing advice and support, and where necessary taking enforcement action. So these systems are set out very clearly, but of course as part of our consideration of the recommendations of the Sheriff, we will ensure that all appropriate aspects of this are looked at in an appropriate way.
Paul McLennan.
The Tory UK Government continues to show contempt for workers with their proposed anti-trade union legislation. Does the First Minister share my concern about the impact which these plans could have on the rights of people working in devolved public services, and will she join me in condemning and opposing this brazen attack on trade union rights?
First Minister.
This is a really important issue, Presiding Officer. The UK Government, I think it's important to make this point, already has the most anti-trade union laws in Western Europe, but this bill threatens to undermine and weaken the rights of workers even further. We strongly oppose any bill that undermines legitimate trade union activity and doesn't respect fair work principles. I think as governments we should be working with the public sector and with trade unions to reach fair and reasonable settlements respecting the legitimate interests of workers, not trying to pour fuel on fires or take away workers' democratic rights. And these will be points I make very strongly when I see the Prime Minister later this evening.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Gorgie City Farm, which gives volunteering opportunities to disadvantaged young people and adults, as well as providing a wonderful green play space and learning space in one of the most urban parts of the capital, is due to close on Monday. Now, I know the First Minister will be aware of the incredible value which this community facility provides, as she's previously visited one of Scotland's last urban farms. So can I ask the First Minister what emergency support could be made available to help keep the farm going in an interim period? And will Ministers also agree to meet with myself, Council and local campaigners to discuss a way forward to save the farm?
First Minister.
Firstly, I have visited Gorgie Farm, so I'm very well aware of the excellent work that it does and its real value to the community and I think to Scotland as a whole. Of course, if there are any reasonable steps the government could take to support a way forward, we would certainly consider doing that, and I will ask the relevant minister to meet with the member of the council and representatives of the farm if that would be helpful and appropriate to consider any options for the future. So I will ask that that is taken forward with all due haste.
Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A mother in my constituency has provided me with data showing that this year, for many courses at the University of Edinburgh, outside of very welcome widening access places, there were 0 Scots admitted. For Scottish pupils from ordinary families and an average school, the doors are closed, no matter their mind or their endeavour. For 440 years, the University of Edinburgh has admitted among the best and brightest of Scotland: Walter Scott, Catherine Granger, Stuart MacDonald, Robert Louis Stevenson, Joanna Cherry. All great minds who worked hard and gained entry to study law here in our capital city. With funding frozen for 13 years, Presiding Officer, and the SNP's cap on Scottish students, the historic promise of a Scottish education is broken. After 5 centuries, First Minister, how has it come to this?
First Minister.
I'm actually, for reasons that I'll come on to, I'm actually quite, forgive me if this is not parliamentary language, Presiding Officer, I'm actually quite gobsmacked that that question has been put in that way by a Labour member of Parliament. Let me first of all give these facts. A record number of young people secured places at university in this latest UCAS cycle. A record number of 18-year-old Scots have secured a university place, up 20% since 2019, the last year there were exams. And the data, yes, provides a really positive story for those applying from deprived areas. 18-year-olds securing places from the most deprived areas have increased by 31% since the 2019 cycle, and all aged acceptances from the most deprived areas are up by 4%. And this is where I take issue with Michael Mara. In my earlier days as First Minister, I used to be regularly criticised for the fact that there were too few young people from deprived communities going to university. Now I appear to be being criticised for the fact that there are too many going to university. You know, 30. I don't come from a deprived background. I come from a working class background. I went to a state school. When I studied law at Glasgow University, I was very much in the minority. So I think it is really good news within a context of a record number of young Scots at university. I think it's really good news that we're seeing more from the most deprived areas actually going to our universities.
And Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be very aware that there are people from Tory and other Aberdeen campaigners here today. They are angry that they face losing their community's last remaining green space, St Fittick's Community Park. Tory contains the most concentrated area of multiple deprivation in the north of Scotland. Losing St Fittick's will be detrimental for residents' health and well-being and bad for wider social and environmental justice. Will the First Minister support Tory residents and others' calls to save the park for current and future generations by using powers under the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997 to ensure St Fittick's is not rezoned for development?
First Minister.
Well, I know there is very strong feeling on this issue. However, Aberdeen City Council have notified ministers of their intention to adopt the local development plan, and ministers will now consider this. As part of our scrutiny, we will consider previous Scottish Government recommendations and check on whether reporters' modifications have been fully translated into the modified plan. And of course, ministers will set out a decision in due course.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. Point of order, Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I note the First Minister referenced live data when talking about the current delayed discharge situation. And as far as I'm aware, the live data is not public. The Office for Statistics Regulation has made clear that when information is used to publicly inform Parliament, it should be published in an accessible form. So can I ask the Presiding Officer if she will seek the First Minister to make a commitment to publishing that as soon as possible?
Yes, thank you, Mr Burnett. That is not a matter for the Chair, but your comments are on the record. There will be a brief pause before we move on. There will be a brief suspension before we move on to members' business.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.